A 7-year quantitative and qualitative study on non-democracies in Europe and Latin America and late 18th century democracies, including the United States, show that mandatory public primary schools were created by governments in response to conflict to indoctrinate people to accept the status quo and maintain the social order. Governments could easily influence the masses' children to respect authority, the state, and its laws. In the late 18th century U.S., after Shay's rebellion, where a group of poor farmers and Revolutionary War veterans attempted to shut down the Massachusetts courts in protest against debt collections against veterans and the heavy tax burden borne by the colony's farmers, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison that it should be taught in schools that violence is an illegitimate way for citizens to express discontent and that it should be drilled into them to express it by voting. This article is by Christine Clark and Inga Cadera. Christine Clark is the Director of Communications at the Rady School of Management and School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. Inga Cadera is the Communications Director for Social Sciences at UC San Diego, and they're writing, "Educate to Indoctrinate. Education systems were first designed to suppress dissent. New research explores the origins of state-funded schools across 40 different countries" on April 28, 2022. I'll read excerpts from the article. Public primary schools were created by states to reinforce obedience among the masses and maintain social order. The study finds historical patterns from 1828 to 2015 across countries, including mandatory primary schooling itself being implemented after social unrest. When there are periods of internal conflict, states will introduce education reform that is designed to indoctrinate people to accept the status quo. Violence can heighten elites' anxiety about the masses' moral character and the state's ability to maintain social order. Public education systems were created and expanded to teach obedience. A recent example is the 1776 Commission, a wave of bills that banned public schools from teaching racism. Non-democracies in Europe and Latin America, the U.S. used primary education as a policy tool to prevent future rebellion and promote long-term order. Paglayan spent 7 years conducting the study. Her findings are based on quantitative data combined with qualitative evidence. After several violent uprisings in the late 18th century, such as Shay's Rebellion and the Whiskey Rebellion, politicians became increasingly interested in education. Soon after Shay's Rebellion, Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison it should be taught in schools that violence is an illegitimate way for citizens to express discontent and that it should be drilled into them to express it by voting. The research explains why primary education systems precede the rise of modern democracy and were first created by non-democratic regimes. For example, Prussia was among the first to introduce tax-funded compulsory primary education. The education system was conceived as a long-term solution to the problem of social unrest, revealed by peasant rebellions in the 1740s to 1750s. Other countries were inspired, including the United States. She also finds patterns of schools becoming compulsory after parents resisted, when children were needed at home to provide labor. During most of the history of public schooling, secondary schools and universities were reserved for the upper classes. However, through primary education, states could easily influence the masses' children to respect authority, the state, and its laws. Children are like sponges. Politicians thought that primary schools could shape behavior by instilling fear of punishment for misbehavior or promoting rewards for proper behavior. The mere act of attending school every day, sitting still, not speaking out of turn, and following schedules, routines, and rituals like marching in silence from classroom to break room would make individuals internalize from a young age what constituted good manners and civil behavior. Now let's do some analysis. If it hasn't been clear to you already, school was never meant to actually teach you anything useful in life for you to build a sustainable lifestyle and community. If this was the case, then there would be no need for the massive slave market where individuals are sent to different plantations called corporations to work for their entire lives just for enough money to trade in credits for food, a necessity of life, and housing, clothing, and other things. And you would actually know how to do and innovate the things that keep the world running, including how to make your own clothes, how to build your home, how to set up your plumbing, your lighting, and electricity, renewable energy sources, and many other valuable things that are essential to sustaining your life, such as, maybe foraging or growing food in the wild so that you can have a harvest for yourself and your village year-round. But no, it should be clear that instead of learning these things in school that would actually be helpful, you learn about very specific topics that can only be used within limited roles at certain plantations, known as corporations, because you need to sell your body as a slave to work your entire life in order to survive. because there is nowhere on this earth you can live where you aren't under a government's control. Because the secret societies and global elite have used global governments to essentially take control of every natural resource on earth and then created a fake money out of thin air system combined with a legal system that makes exceptions for the exceptionally wealthy to make sure that you would have to rely on this inefficient system for the rest of your life and be taught to be dumb and do nothing about it. This is why you're taught to be quiet, to sit still, to wait your turn, to speak, to stand in a straight line, to follow the leader, to color inside the lines, to respond to bells and alarms, to tell you where to move and when. This should all be common knowledge at this point, but it seems that most of the world continues to want to invest in this system of slavery and obedience training the global elite calls school, or even worse, sometimes they substitute school with the word education, and we are surprised why we are always stuck in a cycle where we have to work until we're old and frail, and we wonder why we wouldn't make a society where food grows openly in forests or besides roads, or just outside when you're walking down the street. These are all possible things, but never considered in reality, where you could eat every day for free. This article specifically discusses a study from the University of California, San Diego, in the journal American Political Science Review that found historical patterns of education reforms, including mandatory primary schooling itself being implemented after social unrest from 1828 to 2015 across many countries. You have been taught your entire life to accept the status quo, which is the current way of things. The way things are, you are taught to never challenge, to never envision a new way of thinking what can be done. This is why the entire globe is tricked every time they go to voting booths for an election and they think they have control over the future of their community. It's the illusion of choice and the illusion of power because, sure, you may vote between 2 or 5 candidates, but have you ever voted to keep the same system and structure itself? Have you ever voted for or against capitalism? Have you ever voted for or against having a president in the first place and instead maybe decentralizing power in your local community? Have you ever voted for completely getting rid of roads and interstate travel in favor of localized, self-sustainable communities that are safer for every person on Earth and not created to tire and work everyone to death? No, you haven't, and you will never unless the global population wakes up, because the whole point of you going to school was to convince you that the way things have been done for hundreds of years is the best way things can ever be done, and whatever is introduced to you, you will accept. Which is interesting considering in one breath some will say, in the United States for example, that we must stick to our Constitution, a document from 1787. But your kitchen stove needs to be updated to the latest technology to function properly, and we need new technology to continue progressing society, like artificial intelligence. You see how this works? Now, let's really get into how you are a slave worth nothing to the global elite except for the blood and sweat you work day in and day out in order to provide for the elite. United States President Donald J. Trump created the 1776 Commission after Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, and the goal of the commission was charged with promoting, quote, patriotic education. State bills ban teaching racism. School doesn't teach you how to think critically. It teaches you how to think how you're taught to think. It teaches you what to think. It is no different than a form of indoctrination where moral values are given to a population. Instead, obedience and order are at the forefront. You're graded and ranked. Your success is literally determined on how well you follow the instructions given to you. Indoctrination or training to be a good character, a good slave in the future. The study's author, Augustina S. Pagayan, a UC San Diego assistant professor with a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science / School of Social Sciences and the School of Global Policy and Strategy, focused on non-democracies in Europe and Latin America, but includes evidence dating back to the late 1700s that democracies, including the US, use primary education as a policy tool to prevent rebellion and promote long-term order. Why is the Black Lives Matter protests or any disorder bad? Obvious. It changes the order of the hierarchy of global elite suppression of me over you, of me owning you. Because if I say, wait a second, I don't want to be a slave anymore. I want to determine my own life and not take rules from a random government I never signed a form to agree with from the beginning. I just happen to be born here or happen to move here. And then you are upsetting the ones at the top of the secret societies, like the all-seeing eye cult that is on the back of the dollar bill, the 33rd degree Freemasons that are aware, the Council of 13, the Council of 33, the Scottish Rite, the York Rite, the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, yes, the people that have their hand over the entire globe, manufacturing violence and protest and repression and treating the world as their global stage, as the Illuminati would say, to trick you into thinking you have power or that others are fighting for your power. Disorder means that they don't get to keep you as a slave anymore. Disorder means you realize that You've been a mind-controlled slave. You've not been in physical chains because that takes too much effort. No, it's too obvious. We need to hide it behind words and mind control through education, how we teach you how things are. This is when you realize that disorder means these laws were never anything but a group of rules that aren't black and white, that you didn't agree to and have no obligation to follow because you're a free human being and not owned. You have the right to live how you choose. Yes, now you get it. Disorder is bad because disorder is freedom. Paglayan spent 7 years conducting the study and collected quantitative data from 40 countries that include school enrollment numbers, and for a subset of countries, the number of schools created and the levels of education expenditures. She combined these with qualitative evidence based on the language found in school textbooks and curricula, plus the content of parliamentary debates, as well as politicians' speeches, letters, and other political writings. This will be important when I reference in a future video why the US is not and has not ever been a democracy, and how it's important that the global elite write the textbooks that are used in school. Controlling the narrative is the first step to controlling your mind and controlling your slaves. So Paglayan cites a letter to Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison as evidence that the U.S. looked to primary schools after a period of insurrection that threatened established institutions. Now, I will read an excerpt from David Icke's book, The Robots' Rebellion, on page 155 that gives light into Shay's rebellion further than what Christine Clark and Inga Cadera wrote about Paglayan's study. Quote, "The idea of a central bank inventing money that doesn't exist has long been controversial in America. Two of its founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, wanted any such bank to be under government control. They could see the dangers of any other system. But another, Alexander Hamilton, was determined to create a central bank in private hands. His backers were reputed to be the Bank of England and the Rothschilds. By 1786, the U.S. was plunged into its first major economic depression caused by the lending and interest policies of the money-out-of-nothing banks, including Hamilton's own Bank of New York. Heavy taxes were levied on the population to pay for the interest on bank loans to the federal government and the state authorities. Farmers were ruined by the banks, and Captain Daniel Shay led 2,000 desperate farmers to take over a number of towns in Massachusetts, most famously Worcester. They wanted an end to interest banking, but Shay's rebellion, as it was termed, was put down." End quote. So soon after this, Jefferson wrote Madison relaying it should be taught in schools, or the indoctrination and mind control system by the global elite, that it should be drilled into them to express discontent by voting. Remember, did your parents choose the curriculum that the school taught? Did your parents write the textbooks? They may have had your best interest by putting you in school, even a good one, but did they write the textbooks? Who wrote your textbooks? Who funded the writers of your textbooks? Whose perspective is in the history told from in your textbooks? Is it told from the perspective of natives or from the colonizers? Is the history always seen as some continual vision of progress or a continual experience of terrorism for billions of people? Who decided whose stories to tell? I mean, I'm sure a lot happened over the last hundreds of years, not just a few units we discussed in history class. So who decided that I needed to learn the curriculum that you created instead of learning about the individual revolutions for counterterrorism fighting the United States and countries across the world that have enslaved their people? What about the secret societies that we never learned about? Who wrote about slavery? Who wrote about how slavery ended? Did they cite the 13th Amendment and say that slavery shall exist as punishment of a crime to teach students that slavery still exists today? Who decided what words to use? Nice words or bad words? Are you catching on? Yes, you're being played and being played very, very bad. Wake up. Now do you know why your vote never mattered? Both parties are controlled by and report to the same system that has never been challenged, the system that was never voted on, the vote that was never held. Do we still want to continue going down this path? Of course you will never vote on that. You only get to pick red or blue. Now, swallow the pill. Of course, the research made it clear why primary education systems precede the rise of modern democracy and were first created by non-democratic regimes. Another illusion. Prussia introduced compulsory education that was tax-funded. Taxes are another issue we'll save for another day. Introduced to quell unrest from the peasants in the 1700s. Other countries were inspired, including the United States. The evidence also shows parents resisted sending their children to school to shape their moral character at a time when children were often needed at home to provide labor. Now the parents and the children are separated all day long, and we wonder why we have so many family issues and lack of connection, because everyone is either being indoctrinated or working as a slave at a corporation or for themselves with no choice of if they want to continue participating in the system or not, and created a whole new system. Now do you know why there's legal punishment for truancy? Children are taught to respect authority for no apparent reason other than I say so. Their ideas are shut down if it doesn't match what the elites wanted to say. You fail. And even in some cases, like when I went to school, children even recited the U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. Pledging allegiance to an elite system of control they had no control over, they probably knew none of the laws for, and they probably knew none of their Bill of Rights, as if that ever mattered anyway, but they could recite their national anthem in the Pledge of Allegiance. Beglin's study, aptly titled Education or Indoctrination, The Violent Origins of Public School Systems in an Era of State Building, is available online on the American Political Science Review website and linked in the description below. I encourage you to check it out, and I'll see you in the next one.